Very happy to be doing this because it's on a good occasion of publication of monograph. Austin received his PhD from University of Chicago, like you, in 2017, and shortly after he joined the School of Middle Eastern and North African Studies as Roshan Institute assistant professor in Persian and Iranian studies. He has also been an important, essential, key member of the Roshan graduate interdisciplinary program in Persian and Iranian studies, served as the director of graduate studies for the program from 2018 to 2022. He has since taught a number of essential, important graduate and undergraduate courses for MENAS, and has developed a few new courses as well. In addition to his newly published book by University of Edinburgh Press, the Poetics of Spiritual Instruction, Farid Āttar, and Persian Sufi Didacticism. He has published a number of seminal articles on the similar topics, and that is Attar, Sufism, and Didacticism. But he has also published a number of other important papers and articles. Just to name a few, in 2023, just recently, he published erotic narratives and the development of didactic masnavi. In 2023 again, he published a paper on Nizam al-Din Razi. 2 years earlier, in 2021, he published a book. Well, I mean, he had an entry in Encyclopedia Iranica on one of the works of Attar called Khosrownameh. In 2019, he published an article on Abu Sa'id's Dicta and Deeds. Same year, he published an article, another article actually, earlier article, one of his early works on Khosrownameh. And then also in the same year, he published another entry, important entry for Encyclopedia Iranica on Omar Khayyam. So this is a sample of his Austin's achievement. His scholarship and dedication to our programs have proven to be really truly a key asset to the University of Arizona. Please welcome me with joy to welcome Austin.
Thank you, Roshan, for that really wonderful introduction. It means a lot to me. Thanks to CMES for inviting me and hosting the event, and MENAS for co-sponsoring, and to all of you for showing up, in a difficult week in the semester, I think, right? It's everyone's looking at their watches at this time of the semester, so I appreciate you all being here. Today I want to just give, well, my talk is really going to be in two parts. And the first part is going to be a sort of bird's eye view of the whole project, the kinds of questions I'm asking, the sorts of things that I'm interested in, the sorts of methodologies I use, questions I'm trying to answer. And then in the second part, I'm going to drill down more and give you hopefully a taste of some of the analysis I do and some of the close readings I do by focusing in on one part of one chapter in particular. So I'm going to try to give you both sort of the broad idea of the scope of the work, as well as a taste of some of getting into the weeds a little bit. So I want to start with a single verse of Attar. This is from the end of his Attar, or Conference of the Birds, and I'll come back to that in a moment. We'll talk about who Attar was and what kind of poem this is and its context. But it's an interesting little line, and it sort of encapsulates some of the issues that concern me, so I thought it would be good to start with. And this is from the conclusion of the work, where poets will often boast, right, engage in some facts and boasting about how great their works are and what great poets they are and how everyone should love them. So Attar writes, "Gofteman rahparet o beskovad, kin sochan pirha keskovad." My utterances suffice as your leader, for this speech is a guide on the path for everyone. And there's a few things that I just sort of want to emphasize about this. First of all, the Conference of the Birds it's a textual work, right? It's Attar presumably sort of wrote it down himself. It's conceived of as a book, and it's talked about as a book at many points throughout the poem. But as is conventional, and this is often how poetry is talked about in the Persian tradition, we use words like gofte, right, utterance, or sofhan, speech. Poetry is something that you'd use the verb sung down, right, to sing, or go down, to say. So it's a textual work, but in the kinds of terms that are used to refer to it, it doesn't lose that connection to orality. Right? And these particular utterances that make up the metapoetic are further here personified as a spiritual guide in the tradition of Sufism. Right? So the book is being talked about as a guide, a ḥār, a leader, and as a peer, right? A peer or a sheikh, a Sufi guide. The institution of the guide is really very, very important. It only becomes more important in the 12th and 13th centuries when Attar is writing, when we have the rise of what's sometimes called the training guide. And this would be someone who's not just sort of lecturing on religious sciences, but is sort of intimately involved in the spiritual life of his disciples, prescribing different spiritual exercises to help sort of the disciples get over what blockages they have and move forward along the path. Right? So someone who's very intimately involved in their lives, and oftentimes these very intense bonds of loyalty between disciples and masters. So here the text is being sort of personified as a guide, right? It's being endowed with some agency. The idea is that it can sort of take its readers and help move them down the path. The final thing I wanted to talk about here is who this is for. He says it's pure ha-keskovad, so it's a peer for anyone, or for everyone, right? It has a sort of universal reach, potentially. And again, this is being written in the 12th and 13th centuries when Sufism is becoming more popular. It is sort of penetrating into different classes of society. It's on its way to becoming the dominant mode of piety, really in the Islamic world broadly. At the same time, however, Sufism, even as it becomes super popular, it still has this sort of elitist sort of tenor to it, right? So it's something for the Hawass, for the elites, not for the Awam, for the plebeians, right? But here Attar is suggesting that his poem is a sort of metaphorical guide for potentially everyone. Now, this is an example of something that I think should not be taken literally, right? This is a boast. This is a kind of conventional fact. I don't think Attar is actually saying, hey, we can get rid of all of our spiritual guides and you can all just read my poem. I don't think that doesn't really make any sense. But I do think it should be taken seriously, right? In the sense that for this to be a felicitous boast that does what it's supposed to do, it has to be possible to sort of think poetry in these terms, right? It has to be able to make sense to describe it in this way. So the fact that he's describing his poem, boasting of his poem as a sort of agent of pedagogical change, I think is really important and gives us some clues about the function of didactic poetry and its potential in this period. And this is the kind of stuff I'm really interested in the book. I'm interested in thinking about how poetry, in particular Attar's poetry, gestures towards its own audiences, how it gestures towards its own performative functions, and what this can tell us about the role of didactic poetry in sort of the cultural imaginary of the 12th and 13th centuries. Attar, I think, is an interesting person to do this with, and a sort of good topic for this study, because of his position in Persian literary history. So, Sufis are using poems in their sermons, in their Sama ceremonies, at least as far back as the 10th century. So we have figures like Abu Sa'id al-Attar, who's a very famous sort of preacher and Sufi sheikh. There's a number of quatrains that are attributed to him, and quatrains are sort of two-line for hemsticks, for misras, informal kind of poetry, sort of folk form of poetry. And we know from the hagiographies that he would use these in Sama ceremonies and to underscore various points in his sermons. Now, there's all sorts of issues with authenticity that are, these weren't set down in writing until a century later. Maybe he wrote them, maybe they didn't. Even if he did write them, though, that is not enough to sort of qualify one as a poet in the technical sense, right? Abu Sa'id al-Attar doesn't appear as a poet in any of the important biographical anthologies, at least not until way, way later. People of all sorts would compose quatrains, astronomers, philosophers, religious scholars. It doesn't really make someone a poet in a sort of, professional sense. It's not until we get to Sanai, who dies in the early 12th century, that we start getting Sufi themes in what I would call the sort of prestige forms of courtly poetry, masnavis, qasidas, and ghazals, which at that time are actually still in the process of crystallizing. Even here, though, the modern scholar who's worked the most with Sanai, the late J.T.P. de Bruyne, who just passed away a month ago maybe, he's a little bit reluctant to call Sanai a Sufi poet, because while some of his poems have what seem to be a pretty clear Sufi valence, a number don't, maybe even the majority don't, and he also doesn't seem to be socially connected to anyone that we would really call Sufi. He seems to be running more with Hanafi preachers. I might quibble with that a little bit. The line between preachers and Sufis is not really that distinct. It's not really a line at all, I would say, but that's okay. That's for another day. When we get to Attar in the 13th century, though, here we have someone who I think it's fair to say the Sufi ethos really infuses all of his poetry very clearly, and he's very, very prolific. So he has a huge divan that includes qasidas, ghazals, tawqiban, tawjiban. He has a standalone collection of quatrains that he curated himself and put in thematic chapters, which is unprecedented in the Persian literary tradition. He's got a prose hagiography, the Tazkirat al-Awliya, in which he translates miracle stories and sayings of the saints from Arabic and older dialectical Persian into contemporary Persian. And he's got the most famous are his masterpieces. Right? These are what most people tend to study today, and he's probably best known for. And in many ways, it's actually what I rely on most in this book, although when I talk about today, I'm actually going to be talking more about the Tazkirat al-Awliya and ʿAttar. And masnavis, for those of you who don't know, They're formed with rhyming half lines, rhyming mistra, right? So, Ofte man to best bogad, King Sohan Pure Han Kes bogad. So the rhyme here is S, right? S. And then you have bogad as a sort of relief. And this means that you can write really long poems, right? Because in the traditional mono-rhyme forms like Qasideh and Ghazal, this single rhyme is maintained all the way down, right? Which means sooner or later you're going to run out of rhymes, right? Even in a very rhyme-rich language like Arabic or Persian, you know, after like 60, 70 lines, you're going to start reaching. You're going to start reaching for rhymes and things like a little bit recherche, maybe. But with a Masnavi, you don't have that problem because the rhyme changes every line. So you can get poems that are 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000, 30,000 lines long, no problem. And most of Attar's poems are probably like I think his Masnavis are all between 3,000 and 6,000 lines. So they're pretty substantial. They're pretty substantial. And of course, you can have Masnavis in many different genres, right? This is a form, not a genre. You can get epics, of course, romances, and the genre that Attar is mostly writing in, I consider it a genre, is something I call the didactic Masnavi. And these are, they have a lot in common with the speech of preachers. They're essentially long homilies, sort of sermons in verse, in which the speaker will admonish his audience to all sorts of things, virtues of silence, to tamp down on the carnal soul, exhort them to veneration of the prophet, virtues of moderation, all sorts of things, you know, the ills of backbiting. So it's all sorts of sort of ethical lessons and admonishments, which are then illustrated through narrative exempla. So short stories and tales, right, will sort of concretize these teachings. And these will be taken from all sorts of different sources. So you get stories of the prophets, you get stories of Muhammad, the prophet, and his companions. You get things taken from pre-Islamic Iranian kings like Ardashir and Nushirvan. You get animal fables, stories of the saints, stories of more recent historical figures like Mahmud al-Ghazna, Nizam al-Mulk, Harun al-Rashid, stories of fantastic beasts. So it's kind of a sort of, it's almost a sort of omnivorous super-genre, right, that can take sort of narrative material from all sorts of other sources and then adapt it for its own didactic ends. So it has sort of an encyclopedic quality in many ways, and it covers all sorts of different kinds of points. And as I mentioned before, this is a time when Sufism is becoming more popular. A lot of people will connect the popularization of Sufism to its increasing entanglement and expression in Persian literary texts. I think that this has led to these texts oftentimes being approached really as sort of ways to better understand or flesh out this sort of emerging kind of popular Sufi worldview, right? And the sort of locus classicus here, of course, is Helmut Ritter's Ocean of the Soul, Kasmer der Seele, which was published in the 50s originally. And what he does here is he takes, it's quite an ambitious work, he takes anecdotes from all across Attar's 4 commonly thought to be authentic Masnavis. He categorizes them by theme, translates some of them, gives commentary on them, and in doing so, he tries to reconstruct what he calls the 13th century Sufi thought world, right? So it's basically an attempt to look at these poems and sort of holistically consider what are their teachings and what can they tell us about sort of Sufi beliefs in this period. And that has sort of been, I think, it's fair to say, a route that most people have taken when they look at these poems. Are sort of concerned with what are their theology and what is their metaphysics. No one does it with the scope that Ritter tries to do, because it's crazy. He tries to cover everything. But people might take a particular masonry or a particular section of masonry or thematic organization to learn, what does Attar think about other religions, or what does he think about the wise fools and sort of holy few fools, these kinds of things. What is his theodicy? Other people have looked maybe more at what are formal issues in some of these poems, the kind of language that's used, narrative structure. And that's all really, really useful and good. But I think that sometimes people have been sort of focused on sort of what are the teachings of these poems, but they haven't really looked at what is their teaching activity, right? How do these poems sort of construct participatory relationships with their audiences? How do they imagine their effects on those audiences and sort of take them along the Sufi path thereby? And that's what I'm really interested in. That's what I think actually Attar stresses. That's what he stresses in that opening line that I showed you, right? About the poem as being personified as a sort of Sufi god. So that's what I'm really trying to do in this book. And those sorts of questions haven't really been asked, and I think one has to do with methodological issues, right? So of course reception is very difficult to trace, right? Especially in this period. It can be done, I think, in sort of oblique ways. So we know something about how texts like this were read in some Sufi communities because of the hagiographies that were produced. We'll talk about how texts were used. We can look at manuscripts, marginalia, and how things are laid down on a page, right? This is a kind of consumption. We can look at response poems. We can look at translations and commentaries. This is also a way of sort of measuring reception. But most of these are not available for at least a couple of centuries after Attar was actually writing. Right? We don't have manuscripts for a century and a half until Attar's death, which is not unusual in this period. So it's hard to say how the actual communities that he was writing for would have consumed these. I think, however, that we can actually look at the poems themselves. Not to understand reception, of course, because the poem precedes that, or usually it does. Not reception by historical readers. But we can look at the poems to see how they sort of imagine a kind of audience, or gesture towards a kind of audience, and idealize that audience's relationship with the poems. So we can look at the poems for a sort of implicit poetics, the kind of way that they think about the function of didacticism in the larger cultural imaginary, and how Attar sort of uses that to try and guide, or how he sort of manipulates those assumptions to try and encourage particular kinds of readings. And there's a few ways of trying to get at this. So one is sort of relationships between persona and addressee, and I'll talk about all of these in a bit more detail. One is metapoetic reflections, like the verse that I showed you at the beginning, and another one is Attar's very interesting recursive frame tale structures. Okay, so first of all, and I don't want to say all poems, but most poems, and certainly most poems in the pre-modern Persian tradition, we can imagine them being spoken by some sort of persona, right? There's some sort of imagined persona that speaks the lines we read. And these are conventionally established, right? So you might have a lover who addresses a kind of beloved. And I should say, opposite these persona, there usually is some sort of imagined addressee, right? That is also conventionally determined. So in the ghazal, you might have a lover addressing an absent beloved, perhaps, or maybe a rival for the beloved, or maybe sympathetic friends who the speaker wants to share their love pains with. You might have a supplicant addressing a patron, right? We see this in a lot of panegyric poetry. You might have a sort of sage figure providing advice to a younger man, or a kind of a preacher figure delivering a homily to audience that's clustered, at the feet of the pulpit. And a lot of these are associated with different genres, ghazal or panegyric poetry, or andars or zohtiyat. But of course they can cross between genres as well, and sometimes you'll see one poem, a persona can shift, right? The speaker can wear different masks throughout. These last two are particularly important for didactic poetry and for ʿAttar and the didactic masterpiece. There's a lot of ways in which the didactic masterpiece sort of recalls the discourse of preachers, as we can tell from the few surviving sermon texts that we have, also people like Ibn al-Jawzi, who wrote a manual of preaching, from the use of exempla to the kind of paratactic structure, to a kind of accusatory mode of address. So I'll give you an example of this. This is a sort of, it's from a homiletic section of the metapoetic, in which Attar sort of admonishes his reader, or admonishes his addressee rather, to not be so prideful. And it actually comes after a very funny story. The story is that there is a Sufi sheikh who's leaving his Sufi lodge, and he's feeling very good about himself. He's surrounded by all of his followers, all of his disciples, and he thinks to himself, well, I don't even think Bayezid Bistami, a famous Sufi from the 9th century, probably he didn't even have as many disciples as I have, and certainly on the plane of resurrection, I'll be welcomed, just like I'm being welcomed now, surrounded by these supporters. So he's having these prideful thoughts, and then at that exact moment, the donkey that he's riding just lets out this enormous fart. And so he interprets this as like a rebuke from God, right, for his pride. And so the narrator then sort of turns to their reader, the sort of addressee, this homiletic addressee, and says, as long as you remain mired in pride and conceit, you will remain far, far from the truth. Destroy that pride and burn that conceit. You are present to the carnal soul. Burn that presence. O you who turn a different color every minute, and have a pharaoh at the base of every hair. As long as one speck of you remains, there will be 100 signs of your hypocrisy. It's quite accusatory, right? There's a pharaoh at the base of every hair. This is, of course, referencing the Quran, where Pharaoh calls himself Rab, or Lord. And later Sufi commentary, this is seen as a kind of metaphysical revolt, really. Oh, you who have a different color every minute. This kind of direct address with evocative is very common in this kind of homiletic discourse. And a lot of times it's actually a lot worse than this. So Attar will routinely address his addressees, Ghafil, oh you ignoramus, you ignorant one, Jew, you fault finder. A lot of times these insults, these sort of derisive way of talking to the addressee is highly gendered. So he'll refer to the addressee as a woman and say, Zan, why don't you go put on baubles and tints and leave the spiritual path to the manly man. This is pretty common. Or mohanas. Mohanas is a male who lets himself be sexually penetrated by another male, and this is a sort of common way that he'll address his addressee, actually, to imply sort of spiritual laxity. And so there are all sort of ways of unmanning, right, or emasculating the addressee, and assuming that a recipient's being imagined who's a mature male, that this is it's not so nice, I guess. But of course, there's a sort of pedagogical motivation behind this, right? The idea is that he's sort of using this derisive language to motivate reform, right? To motivate reform. Otherwise, there'd be no reason to do it. Another common way that he'll talk to the addressee is as a boy. So, pisar, oh son, or old boy, right? And this is also kind of unmanning, right? You're sort of suggesting that someone is a boy, right, not a mature man. But it also implies a kind of pedagogical care, possibility of growth, and so that's what he's trying to do. You know, there's an interesting, I bring this up because there's sort of a rough and tumble rhetoric here that I think sometimes isn't appreciated. We'll think of mystics as being sort of these ethereal, sort of kumbaya people. But this can be quite harsh, right? I mean, the idea is really quite literally to sort of put the fear of God in someone to motivate spiritual reform. There's a 15th century biographical anthologist named Dolat Shah, and he has an interesting metaphor for describing Attar's poems. He calls his poems the whip of the people of the path, Tazianeh Ahle Suluk, which I think nicely sort of gets at what's going on here, the sort of touch of violence about this. And so the sort of addressee who's being imagined is someone who, let's see, where did that go? Sort of long-term, maybe is interested in piety, but is sort of backsliding and not able to take those initial steps or follow up on their commitment, right? So they need to sort of have a fire lit under them to motivate reform, right? And we see similar things in sort of actually non-literary homiletic discourse. Now, of course, you can't just say, like, you know, a persona is an author and you know, an addressee is a reader, right? It doesn't work that way, right? These are sort of personae and masks that can be taken on with all. But I do think that these addressees provide a sort of subject position from which readers are sort of invited to approach the poem, right? To sort of approach the poem as if they're a sort of younger, wayward student who needs a sort of firm talking to rather than a spiritual instructor. And a lot of the interest in didactic poetry in particular, actually, I think comes from the many permutations that this sort of speaker-addressee relationship can take in their relationship to implied recipients or implied readers who sort of look over their shoulder. So sometimes, you know, I think the reader is not invited to identify with the addressee so much as actually the speaker. So Nasir Khusro has some poems in which he just excoriates his addressee, who he calls a Nasibi, which is a sort of pejorative term for a Sunni Muslim. Oh, you ignorant Nasibi, you're off to the fires of hell, good riddance, you're so idiotic, but who expects anything but idiocy from an ass, these kinds of things, and it just goes on and on and on. And so one might sort of see there that sort of readers are almost being invited to sort of join in with Nasir Khusro and sort of casting stones at this Nasibi. Other times the preacher persona will excoriate himself, right, and confess his own impiety and his own insincerity, and the recipients or the readers are sort of invited to gaze on that from a distance. So this is one of the things I'm interested in. Another thing I'm interested in is metapoetic commentary, and I don't mean anything very complicated by that. I just mean sort of poetry about poetry, right? So we've already seen one example of this, that the line I opened the talk with is a good example of that. Poets often talk about poetry in their verse, often metaphorically. So probably most of you will know that they often talk about, might liken their verses to sort of pearls or jewels, right? Precious objects that one can gift someone else. The activity of composing poetry will be likened to the craft of jewelry, right? Jewelry making, boring holes in pearls and then stringing them along a string to make a necklace, for instance, or the craft of being an architect and designing a palace. This is less common, but we see it a few times. Or weaving a precious brocade, right? So the verses are something precious, right? And then there's the sort of craftsmanship-like skill of bringing it out. Attar does this, of course, he does this quite a lot, but he has some other sort of more inventive ways of talking about poetry that have sort of less to do with authorship and the craft of authorship and more to do with how people might consume or interact with this poetry. And not just poetry, it's prose as well. So he talks about the Tezkarat al-Awliya being werd, or litanies. So these were pious phrases, Quranic phrases, which would often be recited at specific times of the day and the night. And this would often vary from Sufi order to Sufi order. He talks about his quatrains being objects of contemplation, and offering them up as objects of contemplation to his audience, ta'ammul. And this means contemplation in a general sense, but it's also a very specific kind of Sufi exercise, which deals with reflection on verbal signs and trying to deduce their ethical import and internalize it in such a way that behavior is changed. He talks about one of his poems being a 40-day ritual retreat that the reader can move through. And he also often talks about poetry as a kind of medicine. And I'm going to talk more about that in the last part of this presentation. So he has all these rather creative ways, metapoetic ways of talking about his speech that have to do with real sort of active engagement, often in Sufi ritual terms. The other thing I'm very interested in, sort of the third prong of my analyses, has to do with Attar's recursive frame-tail structures. This is something that's sort of unique to him. There's one earlier poem that has a frame tail, and you see occasionally them after, but it never really takes off. But he really loves these things. And you might, you're probably familiar, this is essentially the story within a story kind of structure, right? So you probably are familiar with them from like Canterbury Tales, or 1001 Nights, or Khalil Wadimna. How this works in the context of the didactic masnavi is that you'll recall us that these are sort of alternating anecdotes and homilies, right? Or anecdotes embedded in homiletic discourse. And so normally if you read one of these, you'll have a tale, and then a homily, anecdote, homily, etc., etc. Attar puts these all in the mouths of imagined speech situations. He puts them in the mouths of characters in imagined speech situations in the frame narrative, right? And I think this is an important move because it lets him draw attention to sort of the dialogical character of this kind of homiletic speech and its rhetorical purposes and specific situations, and actually lets him narrate the effects of this rhetoric on these characters. So I'll give you some more concrete examples, right? So that might make more sense. So he's got three. He probably wrote 4 didactic masnavis that are commonly accepted as authentic. 3 of them use this frame-tail structure. So the first one is metapoetic, Contents of the Birds. This is often assigned in like Introduction to Islam courses or Introduction to Islamic Civilization. So probably many of you have read it or some parts of it. And the sort of speech situation that's being imagined here is really a sort of homiletic, a sort of popular preaching. Actually, they say that's a sort of homiletic assembly. What happens is you have all the birds of the world sort of gathering together, and they decide they want to go search out their king, the Simorgh, which is a mythological bird from pre-Islamic Iranian legend. But then some of them start to balk, right? And sort of the nightingale says, "Oh, I'm in love with the rose, I don't want to go." The falcon says, "I already sit on the hand of the king, why should I go?" So the Hoopoe, their leader, the Hudhud, he sort of takes on the role of a kind of popular preacher in one of these imaginative baths. Here you can see him on his little rock minbar there. And he meets all of their exhortations with admonishment, or he meets all of their objections with admonishments and exhortations, and the sort of anecdotes and homilies that make up the meat of the poem, right, in the genre. Ultimately, he succeeds in convincing them to set out, and they, or some of them, 30 of them, manage to make their way to the Seymour. The next one is the Mosibat-nome. This is a similar kind of homiletic didactic speech situation, but the details are different. This is not a sort of homiletic performance, but conversations between a disciple and a sheikh. So it's a one-on-one kind of discussion. And it takes place in the context of a 40-day ritual retreat on Chile. So over the course of the retreat, people might experience visions, and they're supposed to go and discuss the visions they see with their sheikhs. This particular disciple, he's called a Salik in the poem, or a wayfarer. He has a series of 40 visions, one for each day, and in them he encounters these sort of metaphysical and physical and psychological entities, and he has conversations with them. So it starts with the archangels, and then the spheres, and then the elements. It sort of follows the route of Neoplatonic descent, and then ascent again through compound being, through minerals and vegetables and animals. Before he turns inward, he goes in before the internal faculties, imagination, intellect, sense, soul. And he's sort of suffering from this existential crisis of estrangement from God. And so he asks each one of these entities for help. None of them can help them. They all say they're worse off than he is, except Muhammad. Muhammad says he gives some good tips, but he can't solve the problem himself. And it's not solved until he actually goes into his own soul, and he drowns himself in the ocean of the soul, hence the title of Muhammad's book, The Ocean of the Soul. And he experiences a sort of mystical phenomenon or effacement. But after each one of these encounters, he goes before his sheikh, his peer, and he says, this is what I saw, and the sheikh explains something about that particular visionary interlocutor's symbolic associations, metaphysical role, and then launches into a series of homiletic exhortations and stories, right? The final one, the Ilahi-nome, is a king's discourses with his 6 sons, and through which he explains to them the sort of spiritual analogs of their worldly desires. This one is kind of interesting because the sons also use stories and kind of interpretive commentaries that follow stories in their own responses to their father. So it's sort of an argument using these kinds of discourses. So in all of these cases, the frame tale lets ʿAttar explore not just, it lets him explore sort of the dialogical nature of this kind of discourse, its efficacy, right? All of these people are sort of moved through speech and transformed through speech. And because of this, I sort of consider these poems not only to be didactic, but sort of meta-didactic, right? He's examining the sort of foundations and purposes and function of didactic discourse, even as he engages in it. Okay, so I'm not going to give you a blow-by-blow of every chapter, that'd take way too long, but for those of you who are maybe interested in looking at one part of this, I do want to just mention some of the themes very briefly for each. So the first chapter, Situating Wisdom, deals with the didactic mode in Persian and Arabic. So I see didacticism not as a genre, but as a sort of mode that is present in different genres to various degrees. Mandars, Ihtiyat, didactic masnavi. So I sort of trace that history in this chapter, and this is where I'm particularly interested in personae and addressees, and how that rhetorical relationship between various personae and addressees evokes different kinds of speech situations, right? Like the preacher on the pulpit, or the sort of the sage paternalistically addressing someone else, a younger man, So how these genres sort of evoke different social relationships and situations of oral pedagogical guidance, and how that shapes, in particular, the form of the didactic mastery as a genre. The second chapter, Attar and Persian literary Sufism, deals with how Sufism is becoming sort of more popular in Persian-speaking realms in the 12th and 13th centuries, and becoming increasingly expressed through Persian literary texts. And so I look at that phenomenon and Attar's self-conscious engagement in those developments. Third chapter, talk therapy, poetry, spiritual medicine. I'm going to talk about that in detail in just a moment. The hobo on the pulpit and making text speak deal with the sort of meta-didacticism that I was just talking about through the frame tale. Allegory and Ascent deals with the relationship between visionary experience and literary allegory, particularly in the context of the Mosibat poem. And then anecdotal disruptions zooms in on these anecdotes that populate Attar's masterpiece. And I argue that they have a sort of peculiar, fairly consistent sort of narrative motion. They start out by sort of inviting, by invoking and seemingly assenting to, or inviting readers to accept common sense religious valuations and hierarchies. And then halfway through, the sort of rug is pulled out underneath us, and through some sort of unexpected event, those hierarchies are inverted, or those assumptions are reinterpreted in radical new ways. And so I connect this to the temporality of the ideal course of the Sufi path, and in particular, this notion of tawbeh, or conversion, or repentance, that usually begins the Sufi path. If one wants to become a novice, you go and repent at the hands of the sheikh. And the way this is sort of idealized in a lot of hagiographies and other kinds of texts, it's usually precipitated by this sort of unforeseen, unforeseeable event from outside that causes a total existential life reorientation. So I look at that sort of sudden disruption, and I see it being reduplicated in sort of the narrative temporality of a lot of these anecdotes, and they're repeated again and again throughout the masterpiece. So all these different investigations are sort of really drawn together through my contention that Attar's didactic poems are not just sort of repositories of dogma, but they're performative, right? They're performative in the sense that they do things to their readers, and in the sense that readers can do things with them, right? Because they actively work through them. More specifically, I see them as a literarization and textualization of specific Sufi social relationships and ritual practices, right? So Attar is sort of taking that master-disciple relationship and trying to somehow put it into text, right? Or he's taking he's composing poems that can be used as objects of ta'ammul, of contemplation. He's trying to take the temporality of Sufi wayfaring, reduplicate it in a text. He's trying to compose poems that mimic the structure of a 40-day ritual retreat, right? So in all of these ways, reading itself becomes a kind of spiritual exercise. The textual encounter becomes a site that is conceptualized in Sufi terms, right, in Sufi ritual terms, as a sort of activity aimed at the purification of the soul and actually, at least in a symbolic sense, ascent towards God. There's a few sort of broader aims I have with this. I mean, the first is I really want to push us to sort of think about didactic poetry beyond just its ideational content, beyond just sort of the teachings or the theology or the metaphysics that's implicit in it. I mean, to be honest, Attar's teachings are not particularly unique, I don't think. I think what he says is often less interesting than what the poems do. And so that's what I'm trying to get after. And I think actually Attar and his readers probably would agree with that point, right? That it's their sort of psycho-spiritual effects that are really important. Another thing I want to do is push us to, I want to sort of recuperate didactic poetry. You know, didacticism really has this reputation of being poetically not very sophisticated sometimes, right? It says what it means. There's this sort of tyrannical author who tries to interpret everything for you. It doesn't give a lot of space for readers to respond in creative ways. Some of that has a kernel of truth to it, although I disagree with the value judgments that are attached. But one of the things I want to show here is that readers are very much actively involved in meaning making these poems. And finally, more broadly, I want us to think about Persian literary Sufism, by which I mean poems like Attar's Conference of the Birds that are really imbued with the Sufi ethos and are becoming more popular in this period. I want us to think about them not as just sort of vectors for the transmission of Sufi teachings or terminology, but really as opportunities to do Sufism in a new way. They're sort of opportunities for what I call doing Sufism in a literary mode, right, where the textual encounter becomes an opportunity for spiritual self-shaping that's very much meaningfully in conversation with non-literary Sufi practices. It's actually presented as the symbolic performance of them. But you don't have to be a card-carrying member of a Sufi order to do it. You don't have to be a full-time dervish, right? So in a way, it's sort of making Sufism more accessible. Okay, so the next, I'm going to spend like 15 or 20 minutes to just try and give you, that was the broad overview. I want to give you a more sort of detailed look at one of the chapters, okay? And so this is chapter 3, Talk Therapy as Spiritual Medicine. And sort of take the name from a line in the preface to Attar's Mukhtar. So this is his collection of quatrains, right? And he opens it with a prose preface in which he explains some of the circumstances of the text's production. He writes that his friends came to him and they said, your poems are great, your quatrains are great, but you just wrote so many of them, and we can never find the quatrains we want in your massive divan. So could you please compile a standalone volume of quatrains that's maybe not so long and is thematically organized, so we can find what we're looking for. And he's only too happy to oblige. So he explains that process in his preface, and he also, as is conventional, talks about he engages in boasting, right? He engages in fact. And one of the things he says when he talks about how great his quatrains are, and he does this in almost a sort of throwaway way. He says, Attar's speech in truth is an antidote. Subhane Attar, Taryakas. And antidote, or taryak, this is from the Greek theriac. And this was a compound medicine composed of many different ingredients, but should have opium in it, that was used to treat poisoning, snake bites, scorpion bites, but also as a general sort of panacea for all sorts of aches and pains. So it's a little bit, if you first see that, if you're not familiar with the convention, it might be a little bit striking. But this is a very common way to talk about speech. It's a very common way to talk about speech. In fact, the sort of throwaway nature of the line, I think, testifies to its ubiquity. This wouldn't need an explanation for his readers. Other poets use it too. As I mentioned, it's conventional, but I think Attar takes this metaphor more seriously than others. Maybe he pushes it further. He adduces it throughout his ove, from the Masnavis to the Divan, to the Tezkarat al-Awliya, to the Mukhtar. And he makes it a central component of his public persona through his pen name, Attar, which means both the perfumist, but also the druggist, or the apothecary. And so what I do in this chapter is I try to trace the implications of this metaphor for how we think about poetics, right? What does this metaphor tell us about poetry's function and how people will interact with it. Because when we think about speech as a medicine, I think emphasis shifts from sort of meaning, right, to sort of effects that it produces. It's a more pragmatic way of thinking about speech. It also has implications for authority. Of course, we're concerned about doctors' authority now. Doctors prove their authority through diplomas, ideally. In the pre-modern period, doctors would prove their authority by their own health. There's lots of proverbs about, don't trust a sick doctor, tell the doctor to take his own medicine, right? And a lot of this comes from there. That doctors sort of perform authority by taking their own medicine literally, right? Adopting their lifestyles in the way that they ask other people to do. And so I think about what does this mean for authorial authority, right? How does one sort of prove one's piety through a text such that one's verbal concoctions are efficacious? It also has implications for how we think about how poetry should be consumed, right? You can't just take drugs willy-nilly, but they're consumed according to particular regimens, right? And so the medicinal metaphor bears on that at all. So in this chapter, I worked through all of those implications, and I think it's a useful thing to do because in these sort of theoretical and systematic works of poetics in Persian and Arabic, we don't really get a treatment of didactic poetry at all, right? Philosophical poetics is very much in rhetoric, is focused on erotic poetry, it's focused on panegyric poetry, it's focused on individual lines, but it doesn't have much to say about didactic poetry or mystical poetry or narrative for that matter, or mass studies for that matter. But it doesn't mean people weren't thinking about such issues, and I think in this medicinal metaphor, we can see a sort of more organic, more imaginative way about thinking about poetry and its effects that I think definitely informed and conditioned the way they approach this poetry. So by recovering it, we can sort of understand didactic poetry's significance more fully. Okay, so and as I mentioned, ʿAttar is not the only one to use this, right? Poetic discourse is not the only discourse that uses the medicinal metaphor. The Quran, of course, calls itself a shifa, a cure and mercy for the believers. Prophets are oftentimes by later religious scholars conceptualized as doctors for their respective communities, prescribing laws for their own well-being. Sufi sheikhs, of course, are oftentimes seen as having a sort of medicinal relationship with their disciples, prescribing spiritual exercises that will help them move through spiritual blockages. Philosophy, really from the Hellenic period onwards, is seen as what Martha Nussbaum calls a therapy for the soul, a therapy for desire. And this, of course, would have been widespread in Iran, and also through the translation movement of the Abbasids. You start getting works like Abu Bakr Razi's Tib al-Ruhani, spiritual medicine, which is very much in this vein. Preaching, the medicinal metaphor is very common in preaching. Preachers are talked about as doctors who are trying to cure their audience, cure their listeners. Their medicines may be bitter, especially when they're of the fire and brimstone variety, but ultimately they're uttered for the listener's own good, to help them get to the good place. Ibn al-Jawzi actually has a fascinating book called Ru'us al-Tawarir, the sort of tops of the vials, or the best of the vials. And this is a homiletic treasury, which he's included like invocations, stories of the prophet, bits of tafsir, and he invites aspiring preachers to sort of take a little bit from this vial, a little bit from this vial to concoct their own compound medicines or full sermons. And then, of course, poetry, as I mentioned. So, Khawani talks about his poetry as a cure for the grieving. Rumi in his Masnavi, the opening of the Masnavi, the reed flute, is described as both a poison, zah, and a taryak, an antidote. So there's lots of precedent to this. But Attar, as a poet and also as sort of homiletic poet in particular, is in really good position to make use of this medicinal metaphor. He introduces it throughout the Ov. He makes it his pen name, right? And pen names would not be taken lightly. I mean, this is how you're going to be remembered by posterity, right? And poets are often talked about in essentialized ways on the basis of their pen name, as if it reveals something essential about their character. Attar is someone who makes perfume. Sometimes it's translated as the perfumist, but it's also a kind of druggist or a pharmacist. In a traditional market, an attari, in the bazaar is a shop of, today, a shop of traditional herbal medicines. Right? Pen names are usually taken from the names of patrons, or some other conceptually important word, or a profession. And so a lot of people have assumed that Attar actually worked as an Attar. Shafi Kadkani disputes this. He argues that it was Attar's father who was the actual Attar. But in any case, whatever his actual relationship to pharmacy would be, he's not going to adopt this pen name unthinkingly. Right? He's going to think about what are its metaphorical implications. And he often invokes them in his own poetry. So in the divan, oftentimes, he uses his takhalos, will often invoke sort of sweet-smelling compounds or olfactory sensations. In more didactic, explicitly didactic poems like the Masnavis and also the Tezkarat al-Awliya and the Mukhtarnameh, he'll often invoke his pen name in connection to the practice of compounding medicines. So here's one example. This is from the Conference of the Birds. So he writes, whoever suffers from the poison of religious deviation, these lofty words are antidote enough for him. Although I am an Attar and a dispenser of antidotes, I have just burnt liver, like those who sell adulterated musk. Explicitly connecting the pen name Attar to the practice of pharmacy, a dispenser of antidotes, and using that to conceptualize his poetic activities, right? And their sort of function, right? They're antidotes for religious deviation or innovation, bid'ah. This is interesting because the first line is a clear sort of approach. The second line, though, he confesses, he undercuts that, right? He confesses his hypocrisy. So apparently, a sort of well-known scam in the bazaar was to cut your musk with a burnt liver, right? Because it's kind of a black, sort of charcoaly substance, right? So you could cut the musk with the burnt liver. And so here he's sort of saying, I'm an Attar, I'm so great, my speech is an antidote for everyone. Well, actually, I'm actually cutting my musk, right? And this gets into issues of the performance of sincerity through confessions and hypocrisy, and that's a major part of the written version of this chapter, but I'm not going to be able to get into it today. And the later tradition goes on, continues in this vein. So the biographical anthologist / historian Shishtari, the author of Majalis al-Mu'mineen, he opens his notice on Attar with a bit of verse in which he says, Attar, that bearer of packets of the drug of effacement, whose verse tears afflicted lovers, right? So there again, you get his poetic activity being conceptualized through the pen name as a kind of practice of poetic pharmacy. Okay, so there's a long tradition of thinking about how speech might affect the body. This often has to do with the Hellenic medicine, right, and the humors. Like bloodletting or fasting, speech can alter the different levels of the different humors and thus change the disposition, the tibah, the mizaj, and that can lead to differences in behavior. So I'll just give you a couple of examples of this. This first example is taken from Nizamiya al-Muzi, famous rhetorician. And so he writes, poetry excites the faculties of irascibility and concupiscence through the imagination, so that the natural disposition is constricted or dilated, which leads to the performance of great deeds in the order of the world. So you can see here he's using very obviously philosophical terminology, like faculties of irascibility, concupiscence, and imagination for that matter, and also sort of medical terminology on the natural disposition, being constricted or dilated, to think about how it is that speech produces effects in its listeners. And he's particularly concerned with panegyric poetry and how that might motivate patrons to do even more great things for which they can be praised even more. So he follows this up with a story, famous story about Rudaki, the early Persian poet, and the Samanid Amir, who the Amir goes away on a campaign with Rudaki and the army, and they're going to Khorasan, and they go to Herat, and the Amir loves Herat, and he says, hey, let's camp here in Herat, and they're camping there a year later, and 2 years later, and 3 years later, and the army just wants to go home. So they approach Rudaki and they say, hey, can you compose an ode that will elicit feelings of nostalgia in the Emir, and we can all get home. And Rudaki is happy to oblige, so he composes his famous Buye Juye Modion Hami ode, which he starts reciting, and before he's even done reciting it, the Emir is, on his horse with one boot hanging off. Right? So, of course, Nizami doesn't invent that story. It existed prior, certainly. But here he's interested in using sort of this medicinal and philosophical kind of terminology to think about how those effects are produced. Another example of similar kind of language comes from Ibn al-Jawzi, the homilist and religious scholar, and he writes, the natural disposition of water is inclined to love of base desires and detrimental frivolities, just as water naturally flows towards the lowest point. If it is held back by a dam, it will seek a way around it. And then he goes on to say how homiletic speech is the dam that holds back those waters. And just as dams are, they break down, need to be repaired, spring leaks, you got to repair. You got to attend the Majlis Ebaz, you got to attend more homiletic assemblies to repair that dam that is holding back your frivolous desires. When Attar himself talks about speech's impact on the body, now, he usually talks about its impact on the heart. We see this especially in the Tezkirah al-Awliya, which also includes a prose preface before he gets into actual accounts of saints and miracles and his sayings. So, he says that according to Junaid, the saintly speech is one of the, quote, armies of the Lord, who will succor the heartbroken devotees. And we go on to that. He then goes on to say, for no apparent reason, from childhood onwards, love for this clan has swelled in my soul, and their words were always a mofarah for my heart. And mofarah, for those of you who haven't encountered this, is a specific kind of compound. You might call it a cardiac stimulant. It is supposed to excite and strengthen the heart, and also, of course, bring joy or happiness, as mofarah would suggest. It's composed of a number of different compounds. It's supposed to be sweet smelling and sweet tasting, and also include quite luxurious ingredients like powdered gold. Some recipes even have powdered ruby. And so we can here see too also how the craft of Attari, it includes both perfumery and medicine, right? This is a compound that is sweet smelling and sweet tasting, but also medicinally efficacious. Now, when we think about this and think about why it's important, I think we have to keep in mind the role of the heart in Sufi metaphysical psychology. So, today when we think about the heart, we might think about the heart as a sort of vague center of emotion or affect, right? And even not just metaphorically, right? Because we know emotions come from, right? But in Sufi psychology, the heart is this really special kind of, it's this special sort of liminal organ that connects, it connects the microcosm to the macrocosm, right? And the sublunar world to the higher world, and the particular soul to the universal soul. So it's this sort of isthmus. Ghazali gets at this when he says we actually have two hearts, and one heart is the cone-shaped lump of flesh on the left side of the breast, and the other is a subtle body that is experiencing and knowing and perceiving. And the two are somehow connected, but he has difficulty explaining how. He says it's sort of like the relationship between an accident and a substance, or a tool and the user of a tool, or a place and the thing which occupies the place. The Sufi theorist Najmuddin Razi Doye is a little bit more useful. He puns on al, the Arabic word for heart, and its triliteral root. Qalaba has meanings related to turning and facing and rotating. So he writes, the human heart has one face turned towards the world of divinity and the other face towards the world of the bodily frame. It is for this reason that it is called al, since it contains the two worlds, corporal and spiritual, and it distributes to the body every sustaining emanation that it receives from the spirit. There are narrow veins which, running from the heart to every member of the body, which carry the emanations of the spirit. The heart divides the emanations that it receives, sending an appropriate amount to each member. If for one moment the sustenance of those emanations would be cut off from the heart, the bodily form would wither and life would cease. And if that sustenance were cut off from a single member because of a blockage in the veins that carry it, that member would cease to move and become paralyzed. So you can see how important this thing is, right? And on one hand, the heart is very much rooted in sort of bodily anatomical workings, right? That's acknowledged with these veins, right? And this importance from becoming paralyzed. But on the other hand, it is the only part of the body that sort of is in direct contact with the supernal world, receiving these emanations from God. He actually goes further to say that you can turn the heart more and more towards that upper world through ascetic exercise, such that the heart becomes burnished and it actually becomes the locus of the manifestation of divine attributes in the world. So the heart becomes the sort of channel where God can become manifest here, and also through which we can envisage and approach God. Right? So this is really quite an important thing. So when Attar says something like this saintly dicta are a cure for the heartbroken, I don't think he's just saying that this makes you happy or can cure an affect disorder. He's saying that it can sort of ontologically reconnect someone to the divine. Right? Now, I've talked a lot about how speech is medicine, right? Its impact on the body, the kinds of implications for authority. But of course, there's many ways in which speech is not like medicine, right? Foremost among them being that words mean things, right? And medicines don't really mean things, at least I think we do. If you take a medicine, it's going to affect you whether you know how it works or it doesn't. Maybe the placebo effect complicates that a little bit, but on the whole, I think that's fair. And Attar actually addresses this point as well. Again, in his Tezkarat al-Awliya, which, as I mentioned, is really, in some ways, a translation. It's a translation project, right? Translating Arabic dicta into Persian. So the issue of understanding is really at its heart. And this is what he says. And as is normal, he puts this in the mouth of a spiritual exemplar from the previous generation. So he says, Akafi was asked, if someone reads the Quran and does not understand what he is reading, will it have any effect? He replied, if someone takes a medicine and does not know what he is taking, it still has an effect. So why wouldn't the Quran have an effect? On the contrary, it will have a great effect. But how much greater it will be if they do understand it, right? So he's talking about the Quran here, not the Tezkereh. But Attar draws so many parallels between his own Tezkereh and the Quran throughout this preface that I think it's important, it's clear. Right? The Tezkereh, like the Quran, can affect saintly dicta, contains will affect you even if you don't understand them, but it's going to have more of an effect if you do understand. Thus, his translation project from Arabic and Persian. So, you know, the medicinal metaphor I don't think should be taken as an instrumentalization of speech. Understanding is still important, right? And Attar stresses that. In his own poetry, too, he also stresses durational encounter. So he talks about how, in a quatrain that closes the Roshan, he says, we threaded 100 pearls as illusions then left. We picked 100 roses as signs then left. If you are wise, don't look to the verbal form, but consider the secret that we said in symbols then left. Right? So here, there's this emphasis on slow, careful thinking about what is said in these poems, that a hidden meaning sort of rounds beneath the surface, and one needs to get at that, right? And in fact, this is how they affect you, right? This is where that efficacy comes from. In his Masnavis too, he really exports durational reading and repeated reading. So the Mosibat Malmaid, he says, if you spend a lifetime in it, you'll discover new secrets at each moment. He likens the Manta Altair to a bride who wears a veil and she takes it off slowly in degrees. So he says you should read this multiple times, come back to it, each time you come back to it a little bit more will be revealed to you, right? So there's this emphasis on this sort of durational hermeneutical process. Durational encounter and later rumination on what you've read. Sometimes he even goes further. This is the last thing I'll share with you today. This is also from the Tezkereh al-Awliya. And he here again stresses reading as a process, right? That should be done over time, but perhaps even more than that. So again, this is put in the words of a spiritual exemplar from a prior generation. So he writes, Yusuf Hamadani, God have mercy on him, was asked, when this age passes, and this clan, meaning the spiritual masters, the saints, when they withdraw behind the veil of concealment, what will we do to remain in health? He said, you will read 8 pages of their sayings every day. I therefore considered it an incumbent religious obligation to compose some daily readings for the evening. So here, you know, it's conventional in a lot of Sufi writing that things are just getting worse, generation by generation. We're going downhill, right? So what are we going to do when they all leave? Well, according to Yusuf Hamadani, we'll read 8 pages of their sayings every day. Thus, Attar's translation of the Arabic dicta into Persian and a compilation of this book. The word that I translated this as daily readings following Rositsky, but it's actually varied. And these are these sorts of litanies that I mentioned before. So overall, it would be things that would be actually not just read every day, but recited at specific times as part of a spiritual exercise. And the word also has theurgic overtones. It comes to mean like a charm or a spell, which also, I think, gestures towards the power of the speech over and against its semantic content. Not that that's not important. It starts there, but it then sort of expands to include bodily effects, psychological effects, ontological effects. In a written version, this chapter then goes on to think about the ethical implications of the medicinal metaphor. Right? If doctors demonstrate their authority through their own health, preachers demonstrate the efficacy of their verbal cures through their own piety, then how does Attar do it through text? I won't get into that today. Instead, I will look forward to your questions. Thanks so much.